Welcome back to Heimler's History. Last time we talked about how the Articles of Confederation, which was America's first constitution, failed primarily because there was not enough power invested in the central federal government. And I know that some of my more conservative students hear me talking about investing power in the federal government and want to throw open their mouths a little bit, and they're going to fly into a rage and come to my house, knock on my door, and say to me, as we say here in the South, "Boy, you don't watch your mouth talking about taking away states' rights, I'm going to come to your house and jerk you bald." To which I say, too late. So
it's time to kick it old school.
So in this lecture, we're going to talk about how the founders took the Articles of Confederation and laid them to rest and wrote the Constitution that we know and love today. Now, I think you will agree that the Constitution is an altogether magnificent document. I mean, it was written in 1789, and how many things that were around in 1789 do you still want in your life today? For example, if you had a toothache and needed some dental work done, and I asked you, would you rather have a dentist from 1789 work on that, or would you rather have a dentist from today work on that? I know what your answer would be. Whatever, dude, you don't know me. But if we were having country problems and I said, would you like to scrap the Constitution written in 1789 and let the current batch of politicians write a new one to fix our problems? I know what you would say. Dude, he's in my head. So in 1786, the Virginians took the lead and called for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. And long story short, it didn't go that well, so good old Alexander Hamilton called for a convention the next year to scrap the Articles and write a new constitution. Now, he didn't actually say that out loud, but that's what he intended to do. So next year in Philadelphia, a quorum of 55 delegates arrived. Thomas Jefferson was there, and he said it was like a meeting of the demigods. And he's right. In attendance was George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. And you've got to love Alexander Hamilton. He was only 32 at the time, and he stood in the convention to deliver a 5-hour speech on the necessity of a vigorous central government. And some say it was 6 hours long, but it doesn't really matter. It was long. Honestly, the only thing I've done for 5 hours in a row is fish and sleep. Now, Hamilton's radicalism didn't really convince many of the delegates, but they were all sympathetic to his core ideas, namely that what the country needed was a more energetic and vigorous federal government. And it wasn't long into the convention, after working on the Articles of Confederation for so long and realizing they were hopelessly flawed, that they took the Articles and threw them in the trash. And now that they were beginning work on a new governing document, some very pressing questions came to bear. Perhaps the most significant question was the question of representation and how the people would have a voice in this new national government. Now, for us, the answer is obvious, but they debated it hotly. So you had the Virginians, who came up with what was known as the Virginia Plan, and they argued that people ought to be represented by population, which made all the sense in the world if you were a Virginian, because it was the most populous state in the Union. But those smaller states got madder than a wampus cat in a rainstorm. Why? Excellent question. Let me try to explain it this way. Imagine 3 families. Family A has 10 children. Families B and C have 1 child each, for a total of 12 children. Now, all 10 children in Family A love Mexican food and hate Italian food. Each child in families B and C love Italian food but hate Mexican food. And if all the parents say, hey, we're going out to dinner with our friends tonight, and the children get to decide by vote where we're going, then you know it's going to be cheese dip and chalupas tonight, because family A has the largest population and is skewed towards Mexican food. And that's the Virginia Plan. But the small states came up with their own plan called the New Jersey Plan, in which they argued that representation ought to be equal. 1 state, 1 vote. And back to our families, if we give each family 1 vote, then hey, it's a meatball tonight! I think that's offensive. And that's the New Jersey Plan, and hopefully you can see why each other thought the other's plan was totally unfair. But after lots of debate and bickering and going back and forth, the delegates arrived at what was known as the Great Compromise. Congress would be a bicameral body, which means that any piece of legislation that was to be passed had to be spat upon by 2 camels. Okay, that's not what it means. No, to be a bicameral Congress meant that Congress was made up of 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in the House, the people will be represented by population. And in the Senate, states will be represented equally, 2 votes for every state. It was probably the most brilliant innovation of our Constitution. Now, what I just got done describing was known as the legislative branch of government, and it was the legislative branch of government that was responsible for proposing and passing laws. Now, the delegates also made provision for an executive branch, which is to say the presidency. And the reason they called it the executive branch is because once the legislative branch got done passing laws, it was up to this guy to execute it. Now, the president, among other things, was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but it was left to Congress to actually declare war. So you can see a powerful system of checks and balances starting to take form. There was no branch of government that had the one ring to rule them all. Now, the third branch of government was known as the Judicial Branch, which established the Supreme Court, of which we'll have much more to say in another lecture. Now, I should mention one other of the constitutional compromises that grew in significance over the years. It was another question about representation, and we find it stated in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, and it says this: "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." Now, who were these other persons? Slaves. So the Southerners were a curious bunch, and their whole economy rose and fell on the African slaves who worked in their sprawling plantations. And if you'll recall, they referred to their slaves as chattel, which is a word that means property. In other words, the good Southerners did not have to worry about applying that teaching of Jesus to treat others the way you wish to be treated, because, hey, those things out in the plantation are tools, not people. And that was their justification for holding people in brutal bondage. But all of a sudden, the slave states are looking at the number of seats they were awarded in the House of Representatives and realized those seats are only counting the free population. And if they were additionally to count the slave population, they would get 33% more seats in the House of Representatives. And so they piped up, we're going to need to count them slaves in our population. Yeah. To which the Northerners responded, you're the ones who said they weren't people. Which made the Southerners madder than a box of frogs. But they pasted on their happy faces and they said, man, we was kidding about that old chattel thing. Of course they're people. So the Congress compromised and said that all other persons would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation. And this was known as the 3/5ths Compromise. Now, I know that such a compromise today is a stench in our national nostrils, but I should mention that the Constitution made provision to cut off the slave trade in 1807, so that's good. Anyway, no one believes that our Constitution is perfect. But for all of its flaws, it was a document that upheld and animated the liberty of those it governed. And it even provided ground upon which someone who was considered only 3/5 of a person could later stand and demand the remainder of that fraction. I'll see you next time.